Imagine a land untouched by borders, no cities, no flags, no governments, only endless forests, frozen plains, winding rivers, and silence. Long before America became a powerful nation, before maps gave it a name, this land was shaped only by nature and by the footsteps of the first humans who arrived here. They did not come as conquerors. They did not come with armies or ambitions. They came searching for food, warmth, and survival. This is not just the history of a country. This is the story of people, their struggles, their beliefs, their sacrifices, and the long road that led to the birth of the United States of America. To understand modern America, we must begin at the very beginning. Long before the United States existed, long before cities, borders, and governments, the land that would one day be called America was wild, silent, and untouched. There were no roads, no buildings, no written language, only endless forests, frozen tundras, powerful rivers, and vast open plains. And yet, even in this ancient silence, human life was slowly finding its way here. To understand how the first people reached America, we must travel back more than 15,000 years, to a time known as the Ice Age. During this period, much of the Earth was covered in massive glaciers. Sea levels were far lower than they are today. Because of this, a wide stretch of land emerged between Asia and North America. This land bridge is known as Beringia, or the Bering Land Bridge. It was not a narrow path. It was a vast frozen plain, hundreds of miles wide. Slowly, over many generations, small groups of hunter-gatherers crossed this land. They did not know they were entering a new continent. They were simply following food. These early humans lived extremely difficult lives. They hunted large animals such as mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant bison. Using stone tools and wooden spears, they depended entirely on teamwork and skill. Hunting was dangerous. One mistake could mean death. They wore animal skins to survive the cold. They learned to control fire, not just for warmth, but for protection and cooking. Families stayed together. Knowledge was passed down through stories and experience. Survival depended on cooperation. As the climate slowly warmed, glaciers began to melt. Animals moved south. Humans followed. Over thousands of years, these early people spread across North America, from the frozen north to the warm forests and deserts of the south. Gradually, constant movement turned into settlement. People began to stay longer in one place. They learned which plants were safe to eat. They discovered how to fish, trap animals, and store food. This was the beginning of Native American culture. Different environments created different ways of life. In the Great Plains, tribes followed buffalo herds and lived in portable homes called teepees. In the eastern forests, people built long wooden houses and farmed the land. They developed an advanced farming system known as the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash grown together. This method protected the soil and increased food production. It was agriculture far ahead of its time. For Native Americans, nature was not something to conquer. Nature was sacred. Animals, rivers, mountains, the sun, and the moon were all believed to have spirits. Life was deeply spiritual. Ceremonies were held to honor the earth. Dances celebrated hunting success and seasonal change. Drums echoed through the night. Elders told stories, stories of creation, stories of ancestors, stories meant to guide the next generation. These stories were not written. They were remembered. Farther south, complex civilizations emerged. The Maya developed advanced mathematics and astronomy. They created accurate calendars and massive stone temples. The Aztecs built powerful cities with organized governments and armies. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was larger than most European cities at the time. The Inca constructed stone roads across mountains and engineered cities without metal tools or wheels. These civilizations proved one powerful truth: America was not empty. America was advanced. America was alive. For thousands of years, Native Americans lived in balance with their environment. They hunted carefully. They respected the land. They honored their ancestors. They had no idea that soon everything would change. Ships would appear on the horizon. Foreign languages would be spoken. And a new chapter, one filled with conflict and loss, would begin. But before that moment, America belonged entirely to its first people. For thousands of years, the people of the Americas lived without knowing that another world existed beyond the oceans. They had their own languages, their own beliefs, their own civilizations. And then, one day, everything changed. In the late 1400s, Europe was changing rapidly. Kings wanted wealth, merchants wanted new trade routes, and explorers dreamed of reaching Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, most Europeans believed the journey would be short. They were wrong. In 1492, a sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, crossed the Atlantic Ocean. After weeks at sea, his ships reached land. Columbus believed he had reached Asia. In reality, he had arrived in the Caribbean, part of a continent unknown to Europe. This moment changed world history forever. For Native Americans, the arrival of Europeans was confusing. The strangers wore metal armor. They carried unfamiliar weapons. They spoke unknown languages. At first, there was curiosity on both sides. They traded food, tools, and gifts. They observed one another carefully. But this fragile peace did not last. Europeans brought something invisible and deadly. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly among native populations. Native Americans had never been exposed to these illnesses. Their bodies had no immunity. Entire villages disappeared. In some regions, up to 90% of the population died. This was not war, but its impact was even more devastating. The land began to empty, not by choice, but by tragedy. After Columbus, other European nations rushed to claim land. Spain moved south and west. France explored rivers and trade routes. England focused on the Atlantic coast. Each nation wanted power, land, and wealth. They saw America not as a home to millions, but as opportunity. In 1607, England established Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Life there was brutal. The land was unfamiliar. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Many colonists were not farmers. They struggled to survive. At times, starvation became so severe that people resorted to desperate measures just to stay alive. Without help from native tribes, Jamestown would not have survived. Yet even as cooperation existed, tension slowly grew. Europeans believed land could be owned. Native Americans believed land belonged to everyone. This difference in belief created endless conflict. Settlers cleared forests. They built farms and towns. They expanded without permission. Native tribes were pushed away from their ancestral lands. Agreements were broken. Trust disappeared. Violence became unavoidable. Within just a few generations, America was transformed. Foreign languages echoed through the land. European animals, crops, and tools spread rapidly. Native cultures were disrupted. Traditional ways of life were destroyed. What began as exploration became colonization, and colonization came at a terrible cost. By the early 1600s, it was clear that America would never be the same. The arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of centuries of struggle, resistance, and survival for Native Americans. It also marked the slow rise of European colonies, colonies that would one day become the United States. The collision of two worlds had begun, and there was no turning back. By the early 1700s, the face of America was changing rapidly. What had once been vast forests and native lands was now slowly transforming into farms, towns, and busy ports. Along the eastern coastline, 13 British colonies were taking shape. Each colony was different, but all were connected by one powerful force: the British Empire. Life in the colonies was not easy. Most people were farmers. They worked from sunrise to sunset, clearing land, growing crops, and struggling to survive harsh winters. In coastal cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, trade became the center of life. Ships arrived carrying goods from Europe: cloth, tools, weapons. Ships left carrying American products: tobacco, rice, timber, and fur. Slowly, the colonies became economically important. But prosperity came with inequality. To meet the growing demand for labor, colonists turned to enslaved Africans. Millions of Africans were captured, transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions, and sold as property. Families were separated. Freedom was taken away. Slavery became a foundation of the colonial economy, especially in the southern colonies. This injustice would leave a deep scar on America's future. As colonial populations grew, settlers pushed westward. They wanted more land, more farms, more opportunity. But the land was not empty. Native American tribes had lived there for generations. Treaties were made and broken. Native communities were forced to leave their homes, often through violence or deception. For Native Americans, colonial expansion meant loss of land, loss of culture, loss of life. Tension did not exist only between colonists and native tribes. European powers also fought for control of North America. Britain and France both wanted land and influence. This struggle exploded into the French and Indian War. Native tribes were caught in the middle. Some sided with the French, others with the British. Battles were fought across forests, rivers, and forts. In the end, Britain emerged victorious. France lost most of its North American territory. But victory came at a heavy cost. The war left Britain deeply in debt. To recover financially, the British government turned to the colonies. New taxes were introduced: taxes on sugar, taxes on paper, taxes on stamps, taxes on everyday goods. Colonists were angry. They believed they were being treated unfairly. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. Their message was simple and powerful: no taxation without representation. Protests spread across the colonies. Pamphlets criticized British rule. Meetings were held in secret. Crowds gathered in the streets. British soldiers were sent to maintain control. Tension filled the air. In 1770, violence erupted in Boston. British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists. 5 people were killed. This event became known as the Boston Massacre. Trust between Britain and the colonies was breaking apart. In 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act, giving one company control over tea sales. Colonists saw this as another abuse of power. That night, men disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. This act of rebellion became known as the Boston Tea Party. It was a clear message. The colonies would no longer remain silent. Britain responded with harsh punishment. Ports were closed, laws were tightened, freedom was restricted. Instead of fear, these actions created unity. The colonies began to stand together. What had started as disagreement was turning into something far more dangerous. Revolution was no longer unthinkable. It was approaching. By the mid-1770s, tension between Britain and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. For years, colonists had protested peacefully. They had written letters. They had organized boycotts. They had asked for fairness. But their voices were ignored. Now the question was no longer about taxes. It was about freedom. In April 1775, British troops marched toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. Their mission was simple: seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. But the colonists were warned. Local militia, ordinary farmers, workers, and shopkeepers took up their weapons. At Lexington, a single gunshot rang out. No one knows who fired it, but that moment changed history. The American Revolutionary War had begun. British forces were shocked by the resistance. They were not fighting a trained army. They were fighting a determined population. The war for independence was finally over. After years of sacrifice, the American colonies had achieved freedom from British rule. But independence was not the end of the journey. In many ways, it was only the beginning. The newly formed United States faced an enormous challenge. How do you create a country from 13 different colonies with different economies, cultures, and interests? At first, the nation was governed by the Articles of Confederation. This system gave most power to the individual states and very little power to the central government. The result was chaos. The national government could not collect taxes. It could not enforce laws. It could not pay debts. America was free, but dangerously unstable. In 1787, leaders from across the states gathered in Philadelphia. Their goal was simple but risky: create a stronger system of government without creating another king. The debates were intense. Small states argued with large states. Northern states argued with southern states. Compromises were made. After months of discussion, the United States Constitution was written. It created 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, designed to balance power and prevent tyranny. Many Americans feared that a strong government could abuse its power. To protect individual freedoms, 10 amendments were added to the Constitution. These became known as the Bill of Rights. They guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, the press, and the right to a fair trial. These rights became the foundation of American democracy. As the nation stabilized, Americans looked west. The land beyond the Appalachian Mountains was seen as a land of opportunity. Families moved westward. New towns were built. But once again, Native Americans paid the price. Tribes were forced off their lands through broken treaties and violence. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were meant to expand west, justified this displacement. Progress for some meant destruction for others. Perhaps the greatest contradiction of the new nation was slavery. America had been founded on freedom, yet millions remained enslaved.